welcome to EoZ TV. I am Elder of Zion, and today, as we're continuing on my experiment of being able to try to do live streaming, I have a special guest, Dexter Van Zile, who is the Shulman Research Fellow for CAMRA, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. And we're going to be talking about his specialty, which is modern Christian anti-Semitism, and which is a topic we could talk about for a very long time. Welcome, Dexter.
Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate this. We actually have him on video, so we can show him here. Here he is. Say hi again.
So, the poor people, they can see my bald head.
That's right. Okay. It's not even forward anymore. Okay. Hopefully people are coming. We will see. Anyway, so it's okay. It'll be on video. It'll be on YouTube anyway, and more people will see it overnight. Anyway, again, I'm very happy that you're here with me. Again, Dexter really knows his stuff. It's fun. I was just talking with him beforehand, and it's just a lot of fun just talking to him about this sort of topic. I have a few little things lined up just to bring this out. And as I mentioned to him also, there's what I thought was an amazing book that nobody's ever heard of that I found a couple of years ago, called The Fervent Embrace: Liberal Protestants, Evangelicals, and Israel by Caitlin Karanen. She's a professor somewhere, I'm not sure, Southern Connecticut University or something like that. And but it completely opened my eyes to how much institutionalized anti-Semitism there was in America in like the 30s and 40s. And again, Dexter knows all about this. The thing that fascinated me, and I have it on the screen right now, is that in the Christian Century, this was the editor of the Christian Century, he wrote that he was talking about Zionism. This was before the state of Israel, but he really hated the idea so much. He said it was nationalism that crucified Jesus.
Now, one of the interesting things is that Charles Clayton Morrison, the editor that you're talking about, he had enormous hostility towards Jewish expressions of collective identity. Whenever the Jews tried to act in coordination or in concert with one another to protect themselves, he responded with fury. And Charles Clayton Morrison is a legendary anti-Semite, and he's a stain on the history of the publication Christian Century, and even the current editors know it. And the problem is that his ghost arose again in a subsequent editor by the name of James M. Wall, and who edited the publication between 1972 and 1999, and then he was a contributing editor for the publication up until 2008, and he exhibited a lot of the same characteristics that Charles Clayton Morrison had. And that was written about previously, prior to Caitlin Karenan's book. There was another book called American Protestantism in the Jewish State, and that was written by a guy by the name of Herzl Fishman, and he detailed a lot of the same problems that Caitlin Karanen went over in her text. And wow. Basically what we saw is that people objected more to Jewish expressions of collective Jewish identity, particularly Jewish self-defense, than they did attacks on Jews. And that is a persistent element of mainline Protestantism and their response to the modern state of Israel. And I've said it before, but there are some Christians that really like their Jews beleaguered. But the second Jews pick up a gun to defend themselves, they don't like it at all.
That's certainly true. But in this case, it went even beyond that in the Christian Century. And here's again, I'm bringing up on the screen this example. This is the height of the Holocaust during World War II, when the scope of the unimaginable horrors were becoming apparent. Rabbi Stephen Wise, after checking out that the fact was true, he said that went to the media and he said there are mass exterminations of Jews taking place throughout Eastern Europe, and the Christian Century questioned what he said because they said the exiled Polish government has claimed only that orders have been issued to exterminate half of the Jews in Poland by the end of the year. Not all of them, only half of them. There were 3 million Jews in Poland, and the Christian Century was saying, you know, Stephen Wise is a liar because only 1.5 million are planned to be killed this year. So essentially defending the Nazis and calling the Jews liars for setting the alarm. It was insane.
Well, that's a persistent aspect of how mainline Protestantism has responded to threats to the Jewish people. If you look at the statements that mainline Protestants have made about the Arab-Israeli conflict since maybe the Six-Day War, they've typically downplayed Arab and Muslim hostility towards Jews. And when you try to force them to confront that reality, they don't want to talk about it. They essentially will talk about the security barrier. For example, in 2005, the United Church of Christ, they passed a tear down the wall resolution that called on Israel to take down the security barrier. But that same resolution failed to call on the Palestinians to stop the terror attacks that prompted its construction. And you know, again and again, we keep seeing the same tendency: Jewish self-defense and Jewish power and expressions of Jewish power offend mainline Protestants more than attacks against Jews. That has been a persistent element of mainline Protestant peacemaking since forever.
And it's funny because, I mean, essentially everything you're saying also, you know, fits in with, you know, the far left, with, you know, people so-called progressives. And you would think there'd be very little in common between the progressives, who are generally, you know, anti-religion, and these, you know, mainline churches in America.
Well, you know, the mainline churches really, they're not all that religious. And some of them are more religious than others. I used to be a member of the United Church of Christ, and then I converted to Catholicism. But I would say that the UCC was probably the least religious out of the mainline. And I went to a number of general assemblies and general synods and general conventions of mainline churches. And the United Church of Christ, when you went to the exhibition hall or the exhibitors hall, it was like a garage sale for every far left movement there was. When you went to the Lutherans and to the Episcopalians and to the Methodists, they were much more religious than, say, the UCC. But essentially, they have all been largely secularized since probably at least the 1960s.
Interesting. So how do they actually maintain membership?
They don't.
Oh, really?
No.
People are leaving.
Yeah, well, people are dying, and what happens is that people, you know, probably 1965, they had about 28 million members. And I think they have well less than 20 million now. They've lost 40% of their membership, and it's probably even more than that. Wow. The church that I grew up in, the UCC, used to say that when I started this work in 2005, it had 1.4 million members. And now they have, you know, they're south of 1 million. They've lost about 500,000 members, and since over the past 10 years.
Just to remind the viewers that if you have any questions for Dexter or for me, you could put them into the chat window and we will try to get to it. The next thing I wanted to just mention is and because these guys have been in the headlines, it's been so egregious, is the PCUSA, the Presbyterian Church USA. The low water mark, at least as far as I know, was in 2014 when they came out with a booklet called Zionism Unsettled, an 80-page booklet. They called it a study guide, and it is so, you know, it was just so anti-Israel. It didn't even have the pretense of being, you know, of being fair. Can you tell us what?
Right.
You remember that?
What happened was that was produced by a group called the Israel-Palestine Mission Network of the Presbyterian Church USA, or the IPMN for short. And the IPMN was established by the Presbyterian Church at a 2004 General Assembly, where they said that it was going to be the job of the IPMN to educate people about the Arab-Israeli conflict. And essentially, immediately what they did was they advocated for BDS, or boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And they targeted Israel with vicious propaganda from the word go. And essentially what happened is the denomination itself was so embarrassed by the stuff that was being produced by the IPMN that at a certain point they said, well, that speaks to and not for the church. But the document that you mentioned, it included some of the most hateful commentary about Israel that I've seen. And the thing is, I keep saying that. It included some of the most hateful commentary. It just, you keep seeing it. One passage in that text, off the top of my head, was written by Naim Atik, who's a Palestinian Christian from Jerusalem, who said that Zionism is the problem. And it was laid out there. They said nothing or very little about Arab or Muslim hostility towards Jews. And it was a terrible screed. And the one thing that the church decided is that we're not going to sell this document through our website anymore.
Oh,
and they
really?
Yeah. But the problem is that, I mean, this is a denomination whose, like, intellectual leaders have met with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Mm-hmm. The IPMN has posted, some of the most egregiously anti-Semitic images on Facebook that you've ever seen. At one point, they posted a cartoon of President Barack Obama with earrings that was the Star of David hanging down from his earring. Okay? And so at that point, they shut down their Facebook page. And it gives a perfect example of how this anti-Israel activism leads people into hostility towards Jews. Because
I have a quote from it that says, in the booklet, it said, as a pull quote, so they highlighted it, there are similarities between Zionism, South African apartheid, and Jim Crow segregation in the southern U.S.
Right.
It's crazy stuff, but this is, it's mainstream within that universe.
Yeah, you see, it's mainstream within the Presbyterian Church, and there are people who tried to push back within the denomination, but the problem is that they were playing by the rules of honest discourse, and they got overwhelmed. At one point there was supposedly a truce because things went real crazy for them in 2010. They were meeting in Minneapolis, and they realized that they were destroying the denomination. And so they had what they called a miracle in Minneapolis, and a come to Jesus moment, where they decided that they weren't going to fight so much anymore. Well, what happened is that within the subsequent General Assemblies, the IPMN folks just kept roaring away at Israel. So 2014, they passed a divestment resolution. And in 2015, the United Church of Christ did the same thing. Now, the interesting thing is that 4 years later, the United Church of Christ, their pension board still owns stock listed in the divestment resolution that they were supposed to sell. That they were supposed to divest themselves.
When it comes to making money, the rules change.
Well, and the thing they said, if you listen closely to the debate, you will discover that they say, well, we're not sure that the people in charge of our pension funds don't really think they're going to do this. But they didn't say that publicly. They said, we've joined the BDS campaign.
Right.
As it turned out, and I wrote a number of articles saying, you guys are just a bunch of hypocrites. You said you were going to divest. You never did. And on the QT, you've held stock in these companies all along.
That's amazing. Only last month, the Presbyterian Church, they might have had some, there might be some pushback, but it looks like their head guy, the stated clerk of the church, Reverend Dr. J. Herbert Nelson II. He's still doing, as bad as anybody else is. And I have, again, on the screen these, my article about what he was saying. He essentially was blaming Jews for anti-Semitism. This was in response to the Trump plan. he predicts, oh, it's going to turn into, there's going to be violence, and it's going to be Israel's fault. If anybody starts killing people, it's going to be Israel's fault because Trump came up with this plan. I mean, it's just like, it's a crazy logic. And it kept going worse. And they says, oh, and this is going to feed growing anti-Semitism in Europe. All of a sudden he cares, about the anti-Semitism in Europe. And he's, I love it when they say they really care about Jews. Oh, you guys should do it because it's going to help you. Well, maybe you should listen to us every once in a while. So you have anything to say about
Well,
our
you see,
good
now
Reverend?
that's the thing is that first of all, if they had said something about anti-Semitism in Europe in the years past, okay, maybe you could almost give them credit and say, okay, they've got it wrong, but at least they care,
Right.
okay?
Yeah.
But anti-Semitism has been going off the charts in Europe for well over a decade. And nobody really said much in the mainline Protestant community about it. They have been viciously demonizing Israel, left, right, and center. And at a certain point, it's kind of like, if you were going to speak about anti-Semitism in Europe, you should have done that maybe 10 years ago.
Right. And have they said anything about, even what's going on, in Brooklyn and that sort of thing?
At a certain point, they started to talk about that. Because, once people start getting shot, and the violence came from the right wing, so that gave them an opening. The United Church of Christ said, we need to be careful about the rhetoric coming from right.
No, I'm not talking about the Pittsburgh or anything. I'm talking about the Jews, the religious Jews being attacked on the streets of Brooklyn by
I haven't seen much, and to be fair, and I think that's a good point, but I don't think they've really said very much about it.
Okay.
And you see, the thing is that at a certain point now, what we have is that for about 60 or 70 years after the Holocaust, anti-Semitism was, an ideology that everyone understood was crazy and destructive, and that anybody that exhibited that level of anti-Semitism was kept out of power, and they were kept to the margins. The problem is that now, and part of it's because of the mainline church has failed to hold the line against it. It's not all their fault, but it's partly their fault. Essentially, anti-Semitism is now, it's still largely a disreputable ideology, but it's much closer to the mainstream than it used to be.
And of course, they use the excuse of, well, it's only anti-Zionism, we love Jews, blah, blah, blah.
Well, remember when Aretha Franklin at her funeral? Who did we see on the same stage with Louis Farrakhan? We saw Bill Clinton. Okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
no, it's not, it's some things are just not beyond the pale.
right.
The other topic I know that's near and dear to your heart is the hypocrisy of their obsession with Israel and their completely ignoring or almost completely ignoring every other human rights issue in the world. And I found this, this was from late last year on Human Rights Day, also from the same J. Herbert Nelson, a pastoral letter about just talking about the state of human rights around the world. And he has an entire paragraph about Israel and Palestine. Everything else is just, or almost everything else is just a region. Okay, Europe, here's what's going on. Africa, here's what's going on. The rest of the Middle East, here's what's going on. Oh, and Israel and Palestine, they get the same thing. China gets literally one sentence. It says, the mass confinement and surveillance of Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities is a sign of the Chinese Communist Party's intensifying internal controls. That's it. That's all they have to say. They're not saying it's awful. They're not saying it's terrible. They're saying, okay, it's another human rights violation along with all the others in the world.
You see, now that's the thing is that they were imprisoning male heads of household from Uyghur families and then forcing them to accept outside males to sleep in the same bed with the females, with the women of these families, okay?
Yeah.
That is basically an act of genocide. That's cultural genocide. And it's a violation of the UN the UN Convention on the Punishment and Prevention of Genocide. There's no question about it.
Everything. It's not just
incitement against Jews in the Temple Mount is a violation of that law, but nobody speaks about it. And this is the thing that's so shocking is that, okay, and everybody's talking about the coronavirus, but the coronavirus is basically the consequence of a lack of a free society and an accountable government in China. Okay? And mainline churches have been warning us about the threat of catastrophe as a result of how the Jewish state wields power in the Middle East. That's basically their narrative. The way that Israel, the Jewish state, wields power over the Palestinians to protect itself is somehow going to bring about a catastrophe. They move the embassy to Jerusalem, that's a catastrophe. And what has happened is that over the course of the past 2 decades, the ability of the Palestinians to destabilize the Middle East has decreased rapidly.
Absolutely.
But the thing is that if you look at this whole coronavirus thing, it's basically the consequence of a government that had no accountability. They knew that there was a problem, and they did everything they could to hide the fact that there was a problem. And that's really where the chickens have come home to roost. But if you go on to the websites of any of the mainline Protestant churches in the United States and Google China, you'll find hardly anything about the human rights abuses that have been perpetrated by the Chinese Communist Party. They just haven't said anything about it. And I wrote a letter to the president of the United Church of Christ in October. And I sent him a link to an article that I got off of our Nexus account at Cameron. And I said, okay, this is about the mistreatment of the people, the Kazakhs in China. And I said, are you guys going to say anything about it? Are you guys going to do any shareholder activism? Because you own stock in companies like Apple and Alphabet, which owns Google.
Right.
And he basically blew me off. And I said, this is what I think's going on. I think that you're using the Holy Land as basically kind of a playground for your activists. Because the hotels
that's
are
for
good.
sure true. And not only that you can send people to Israel and they don't have to worry about that they're going to be thrown in jail or hurt or anything like that, but doing it to China, all of a sudden, that's a little scary. And forget Syria.
Right.
Forget that. Nobody's going
absolutely. there. And you see, the thing that bothers me is and there's a guy by the name of Rick Steves that I've been writing about. And he's a Lutheran and he's on the public broadcasting system. And he's done an awful lot of travel shows. And StopAntisemitism.org basically highlighted one of the videos that he made in which he mocked the suffering endured by the Baha'i in Iran. And I've written about it. You can see it in an article that I wrote on the Allgemeiner. And the thing is that Rick Steves, he goes over to, he comes back so empowered by all of his trips. Well, I served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Zaire about 30 years ago, okay?
Right.
I came back a broken person because I started to see the suffering in what is now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo. It took me 5 years to recover, okay? Wow. And the thing is that Rick Steves, every time he comes back from these places, he's so invigorated. And he talks about, and I'm like, dude, and his narrative about the Arab-Israeli conflict is, if only Israel would would give the Palestinians dignity. And so the mainliners, and he's a mainliner in this whole virtue signaling industrial complex, they use the Holy Land in the Middle East as basically the raw material to promote a narrative that they can luxuriate in, where they get to feel so virtuous.
Yep. No, that's for sure.
Right. And they transform the guilt that they have over being part of the most powerful and wealthy country in the world into basically, self-righteousness. And it's a hubristic voyeurism. They look in on the suffering of people, particularly in the Holy Land, and they say, we would do so much better than Israeli Jews would do.
But it's more than self-righteousness, because they could choose any country to be self-righteous in, but they consistently choose Israel. That's the one that we're going to show off, that we're how how righteous we are and how much we care about human rights and stuff like that. And that's the one. Everything else, forget about it. And just like the the guy that said from one of the, I forgot the name of it, but from one of the academic committees that started boycotting Israel, and when he was asked, well, what about every place else? He says, well, you got to start somewhere. And it's always Israel that everybody starts it, and of course everybody ends there too. Nobody really cares beyond that.
They move on to any other country. They just don't.
Right, of course not. And it's so it is anti-Semitism in the end. Whether it's a new actualization of traditional Christian anti-Semitism, which is what I would suspect, or if it's more general because hey, the entire world, anti-Semitism never really went away. So it's you can come up with a million reasons why people hate Jews. But I think in this case specifically, it's like the Christians had it so much as part of really the theology, certainly across the board, up until the church changed things a little bit in 1964, the Catholic Church. But but if you look at and again, you know this far better than I do, but if you look at the Orthodox churches, stuff like that, especially the ones that are in the Middle East or the Russian Orthodox or something like that, their anti-Semitism is theological. Their anti-Semitism is part of their belief system.
Well, it's also the glue that keeps them stuck, that protects them from the Islamic hostility.
For sure.
Because when they were talking about Nostra Aetate, or the Second Vatican Council, and they were talking about how they could deal with issues related to anti-Semitism, the people involved in Vatican II, which was passed in '65, Christians from the Middle East, Orthodox Christians, and I think even a few Catholics, they lobbied the Vatican, said, do not do this. Do not suppress the deicide charge, because it's going to make life difficult for us. Because people are going to think that this legitimizes Zionism as a political movement and legitimizes the existence of the Jewish state. And there were Muslim theologians and commentators who said that the Christian belief that Jews killed Jesus, even though they denied that Jesus was crucified and resurrected, that was one of the elements that Muslims wanted Christians to keep in their faith. Mm-hmm. And so, and the thing is that with the liberal Protestants, I think a lot of it just has to do with the template. That it's kind of a form of the Jerusalem syndrome. Once they get to the Holy Land, they somehow seem to think that they're the Messiah, and that somehow that they can speak words of peace to people that have been in conflict for the past 70 years. And
it's. As far as that's, I certainly today I believe it's self-preservation. When I hear what because again, Archbishop Hanna and all these guys that are there right now, they say the worst. They're certainly anti-Semites. But I do believe that Christians really introduced modern anti-Semitism to the Middle East. Probably in the late 19th, early 20th centuries when all of the missionaries were there, because the Muslims had a tradition of, okay, Jews are second-class citizens, but they didn't have the virulent hatred of Jews that traditionally Christians had, and I think that was an import. Personally, I think that's something. I don't
know. You might be. I want to give some defense to that, but look, we did have the Damascus blood libel sometime in the early 1800s.
That's true.
But the thing is that you also have to understand, I think a lot of it happened during and after World War II with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. I think that's part of it. And I also think that one of the things that you have to remember is that under the Dhimmi laws, anytime Christians or Jews advocated for their own equality or freedom, that made them legitimate targets for jihad. And that was one of the roots of the Armenian genocide. That was, the Young Turks, they wanted to create, a secular state, right. But they used the language of jihad to basically remove and murder large numbers of Armenians that they thought were a threat to their future state. Yeah. And so, and the thing is, and Ray Ibrahim, who's a very knowledgeable guy about this, he says, look, in the Middle East, Israel is governed by the dhimmis who got away. And
That's true. No,
and that's intolerable. And the
well, again,
problem
that also comes up to the honor shame issue, because this
right,
is, you
right.
know, this is there's nothing more shameful than the people that you could always felt superior to all of a sudden showing some backbone. So
Yeah.
yeah, no, this has been great. Again, we're already coming up to a half an hour, so I think that in the interests of trying to keep this watchable, I'm going
Yeah.
to. I think it's time to wrap this up. I don't see. I was asking on the chat if anybody has any questions, and apparently not. So I think we're going to be wrapping this up. But thank you very much. This was really fun. It was really
It was a lot
enjoyable,
of fun. Thanks so much.
and it gave me a reason to learn how to be able to do an interview
All
online.
right.
So, so I'm gonna, if I keep doing this, this is the model I have over here. No, I really appreciate it. You know, you really know your stuff.
Thousands of more shows and
Yes,
thousands more viewers, millions.
millions upon millions. Okay, thank you very much,
All right, I'll
and
see you.
I'll be signing off. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Okay, bye.